So, welcome to Fashion Roundtable's fourth book club. I'm joined today by Eleanor Houghton. Eleanor is a historian, writer, and illustrator specializing in 18th and 19th century dress. And we're here today to discuss her book, Charlotte Bronte's Life Through Clothes. And this is based on 9 years of research. So, welcome, Eleanor.
Lovely to be with you. It's really great.
Yeah, I've absolutely adored your book from start to finish. So, I suppose to kick off, let's delve into how this book came about. So, how did 9 years, this sort of process of documenting and archiving Charlotte Bronte's clothes actually begin? And then, can you delve a little bit into your very interesting background? I know you read English at Oxford, Alma
Yes.
Milliner, and now you're sort of a costume consultant. So, how did this also inform the way you reconstruct and illustrate this sort of, I suppose, tactile reality of Charlotte Bronte's daily life?
Yeah, that's a really good and massive question. So I ended up working on Charlotte Bronte, and it came at a rather kind of circuitous route. So as you say, I read English at Oxford, so was always a big fan of literature. And I had a tutor at Oxford who was a big specialist in Victorian period, and he really instilled a love in me of that period. So that was always going to be an area I focused on as I went on to study. But it was just one of those things where I don't know, life sometimes pulls you together from different ways, doesn't it? So after Oxford, as you say, I went on to become a milliner and learnt very different skills through that. And it's certainly not a natural route post Oxford. I don't think you get many people who read English and then go to be a milliner. It was a bit of a strange thing to do, but I absolutely loved it. And I worked in the fashion industry for a while. And then sadly, as life sometimes happens, I was very sick and had to kind of rethink life. And so after a period, I went back to do an MA because I was sort of finding my way again. I think as often is the case, you have to re-find yourself when you have a big experience like that. So I went back and did an MA in 18th century studies. And there I had a tutor who was a dress historian, a really well-known dress historian. And she really instilled in me this love of dress. And I think I brought with me my fascination with literature and getting to the nub of things as you do with reading books. And then this sort of much more practical side of me that came from millinery. And then learning about dress as a primary source, really, which was a fascinating thing for me to think about. It's not something I'd ever thought about before. I loved clothing and I loved literature and I loved history, but those things had never kind of found a space together. And she really showed me that. And so then when I was encouraged to do a PhD, I wanted to bring all those bits of me together. And so I looked for a subject which did that, really. So I wanted to find someone who had a huge body of clothing, but who also had other types of evidence that would help me to unpack that. And it was quite a difficult thing to find because actually clothing doesn't tend to survive in large amounts in that way associated with one person. And especially not from the Victorian period, because
especially sort of, was it 150 items?
Yeah, exactly. And it's hard to express how rare that is because Charlotte was obviously middle class and it's often only elite clothing that survives. So more ordinary people, not that she was ordinary, but more ordinary people's clothing tends not to survive. So when I found Charlotte Bronte's archive and that nobody had ever looked at it before, I just couldn't believe it.
Yeah.
So it was very serendipitous. And that's how it started, really. And then the reason it took me 9 years is because 150 garments, it's a lot to look at. And it ranges, obviously, there's much more towards the latter part of her life, because like all of us, her wardrobe was edited through time. And none of us have all the clothes that we've worn. But, but there are things from all different periods of her life. And so I then started looking at those clothes and working out which ones were definitely hers, which ones weren't, and mapping them out and dating them all, which was a huge job. But that's how it all began. And then out of that have come all sorts of other opportunities. So yes, I work in film and television as a costume consultant. I've done all sorts of different things, which has been wonderful. And it started with a lot of Bronte productions. So I did To Walk Invisible and Emily, the big Frances O'Connor film that came out a couple of years ago. But since then, I've done all sorts of different things. And it's carried on growing and growing from there, really. And then it started as a PhD and then grew from that into a book, which takes quite a different form from the PhD because I focus much more on the clothes. But in my PhD, I also looked at her physical appearance and the impact of that on her life, which I know we're going to talk about later.
Yeah.
So there's so much in it. And I think because clothes are so meaningful, once you start looking at them, they take you in some fascinating places that I would never have expected to go, when I started this project. It's opened so many doors, but also it's changed my perspective of Charlotte completely. And I hope other people's maybe, but other people will be the ones
Well,
to say that.
well, definitely, because I think there is this preconception of what Charlotte Brontë was,
Yeah.
and I think, to quote you, you sort of, it's this fragile, sexless sort
Mm.
of saint-like woman, but you sort of see that in Bramwell's painting, and her brother
Yeah.
Bramwell, that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery of the three Brontë sisters. But I think that feeds into this overall sort of depiction of her as drab.
Yeah.
Um, and I suppose the question is, how do her clothes jar with this stereotype? Because I know that you've sort of added bits and pieces of sort of eyewitness accounts as you go, and a lot of what that says is she was constantly in print. So that's completely different to
Yeah.
what we thought.
Absolutely. I mean, the clothes themselves, because they are primary sources, give us a lot of actual evidence. So you're right, her clothes are much more colourful than we first imagined. And certainly I entered this, I'd quickly looked at the database, but I had no idea. Her clothing totally defies expectations, or
Yeah,
my expectations anyway. So yeah, there are paisley dresses, there are brightly coloured bags, there are Burberry type cloaks. Actually, I've got some pictures of some things here. We'll do it old school and I'll lift some things up.
yeah. I mean, I'd love that. Let's go for it.
So this is one of her paisley dress. I don't know if you can see that.
Yeah,
And it's very beautiful. And as you say, one of the ladies who lived in the village where Charlotte lived, she said she always saw rarely saw the girls in output print. In other words, they wore clothing that was brightly coloured and printed. And of course, what we've got to remember is Charlotte was born in the Industrial Revolution. And not only that, but she's living absolutely on the doorstep of where this stuff's all really being created. So in Yorkshire, near Manchester, and all these different places up in the north where clothing was or fabric was
yeah,
being produced. And it's time of great technological advancement. So new things are coming out all the time, new dyes, bright colours, and her clothes reflect that and what she was living in. So yeah, she's got bright cloaks. You can see, I call this her Burberry cloak because I think, I think it
yeah,
does look
yeah,
like
yeah. I
Burberry.
see the resemblance. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. And these take their inspiration from blankets and things that were made in South America. So we start also to see the impact of globalization on her wardrobe. So we think of her as this very isolated person living in this tiny village in Yorkshire. And of course, there's some truth in that. But once we start looking at her clothing, we see that she was connected to a much bigger world in many different ways. And actually, her world was very different to, I think, what we first thought. And when we imagine her writing her book, when you think of her wearing her paisley dress, it
yeah,
totally changes, I think, how we perceive her, and maybe her books too. But the reason I can make those statements is because such a lot survives. I'm not basing that on one piece or two pieces.
yeah,
There's a lot of clothes. So you can really build up a picture of what her wardrobe was like and how it evolved over the course of her life. Because, of course, like all of us, her wardrobe changed as her life changed and altered. So yeah, there's so much to talk about, but she certainly defies expectations in so many ways, and her wardrobe does.
yeah.
So
That's
yeah,
what I took from it. I was so
yeah,
shocked. Yeah. And I think so she obviously so through all of this, her clothes sort of bore witness to her life.
mm,
And I think in no other item do we see this more than that of the corset, which
yeah.
was a piece that really do you have a photo do you have
I
a
do. I've got some drawings. Yeah, these are all my original drawings. But so it's hard to see from here.
yeah,
Just what I've got another one somewhere under here. What a punishing piece it is, and it's really not beautiful.
yeah,
If you can see, it's a very utilitarian garment. It's kind of greying. It's got a huge busk, which is the bit that goes down the front, which I actually had remade, and it's really long. And when you
mm,
think that Charlotte was about 4'9", 4'8", 4'9", she was very little, and so this piece was very punishing. When she sat down, it would have made sitting very difficult. It's got a
yeah,
lot of bones, and in and of itself, one of the amazing things about it was I was able to find that it's actually a woven corset, which doesn't sound particularly remarkable, but just in its own right as an object, that's very historically important.
yes,
because it's one of the earliest that I've been able to find, earliest fully woven corsets. In other words, it's not made in pieces. It was very cleverly made on a specially adapted jacquard loom. And so the channels are woven in one piece and then the bones fit into it. So it was an off the peg number, which was really unusual at that time. You'd still go to a mantua maker and they would make one for you. But this was actually something she could go into the shop and buy. And I was able, because it's so rare, to pinpoint exactly who made it and where within virtually one or two streets, which that, when you say it like that, sounds so easy, but actually that was months of work to find out. But you're right, it is such an important biographical piece, because then we're able, once I was able to date it and work out when she bought it and show that she was wearing it or bought it in Brussels, and then I could pin it to this period of her life when she moves to Brussels with her sister Emily to go and train to be a teacher. And it starts off very well, but it's where she meets Constantin Heger, who's this amazing teacher who has this wonderful relationship with her at first. But it quite quickly turns into something else. She falls deeply in love with him. He's married. It's complicated. Yep. She's a vicar's daughter. Recipe for disaster. We can imagine where this is going.
What a scandal. Yeah.
Exactly. And we see in the corset itself, you're right, there are really strong biographical elements within it, because you can see evidence of tight lacing. And we tend to have this view of the Victorian corset wearing as being tight lacing being a normal part of that. But actually, it's very much not. Almost all women wore corsets, but most women wore them quite loosely, especially in that period. And so it actually goes against the norm.
Well, didn't someone write something along the lines of like she wore it so tight that it caused her harm? So I suppose, like, why was she doing this?
Well, that's a really good question. And in that moment in Brussels, she was, after a while, Emily went back and Charlotte went back to Brussels and she was there alone. It was a very difficult time for her. She's in love with her professor. His wife starts to notice. She sort of brings everything down. So she starts being very isolated. She's an alien in a foreign land. She's never really properly left home before, except to go and be a governess. It's a very difficult period for her. And she's really feeling those things very, very deeply. And one of the things that perhaps holds her together is she's actually that kind of feeling of pulling herself in tight, controlling herself. There's even a kind of, sadistic is a difficult word to say, but a kind of punitive quality about it. And I think you can see that. It's not normal. It's only when you look at a huge number of corsets, you can see this isn't normal. This is not normal behavior. And so there is a psychological, emotional element to this.
It also plays into this sort of, I suppose, idea of submissive femininity as well.
Yeah.
And like, that's something I wasn't expecting. Like, if you think of her book and her work and how, that would have been like one of the fastest selling books of her time. And this is, where she's coming from. It's quite...
It's shocking. Yeah, it's shocking. And she sews her own little bust pads into it to give her that kind of hyper feminine shape, because she's very thin. And so, well, of course, once she was tightened as well, it flattens everything. And so there's a sense of her trying to put a very feminine shape, which I think is really interesting. And you're right, but she's actually, as a writer, although she isn't at that point yet a published writer, as a writer, she's going to be thrust into a very male, mercurial world.
Yeah.
And I think once you start seeing that vulnerability, it's very moving. And you see someone who's actually, though she is this kind of feisty, she's called Little Joan of Arc by Thackeray. She's this really feisty character, but then we see this kind of deep vulnerability, which I think the corset represents really beautifully.
Yeah.
It's very sad.
Oh, yeah, sorry. What?
No, carry on. I just said it's very sad.
Yeah, I was going to say, do you think this has come from like some of the extreme criticisms that she faced, particularly when she went off to school for the first time? And I suppose she's also in this sort of controlled eating, controlled obsession with her own sort of virtual reality. You talk a lot about the virtual sort of worlds that they build within their home, which feels safe. And then she draws, you share a caricature of her that's so self-deprecating, but I had to laugh when I saw it, because
I know
it's kind of like, very British humour, isn't it?
Yes, it is. You're right.
Notch nose, big chin, small waist.
Yeah.
So do you think that, are there any other clothes, I suppose I'm asking, that tell us of these insecurities?
Well, I think the dress that we most closely as two dresses we most closely associate with fame, and I think one of them is her striped silk dress,
Yeah.
which is very. It's not, if we were to see it. I've got a picture of it here.
Yeah.
I feel like Neil Buchanan. Like, here's
Yeah, I
something
love
like
that.
this.
Oh, I just really, yeah.
So it's a very strange dress. I don't know if you can see it very clearly there, but it's a dress that is not at all what we'd associate with Charlotte. And in fact, when I found it in the cupboard, it's one that had never been shown. Everyone had sort of presumed it wasn't Charlotte's, and it sort of ended up in the archive, sort of, somehow, and it may not have been Charlotte's or whatever. But once I started working on it, I saw it was Charlotte's, looking
Yeah.
at the sizing and all of those things. But it is a really interesting dress because it doesn't fit with the stereotype or the typical dress of the period. So it's obviously a gown that's worn. You can see it's covered in feathers and bows and little bits of flower, and it's very, very ornate. It's obviously a dress that would have been worn to something like a ball or an opera, which of course she started doing when she's in fame. And it's a surprising dress because equally it doesn't fit with the stereotype of the day, or the codes and conventions of the day, I should say. So mostly those would have been off the shoulder, a much sort of more evening-y attire. And this has got a high neck, long sleeve. So we see a kind of prudish element, maybe, and a desire to cover herself a little bit. And I think that shows that she's thrust into this world of fame that's very difficult for her. And she doesn't quite know how to operate within that. So we see a discomfort and unease in that dress, and also an awareness, I think, that she's probably being dressed by other people and influenced by other people. And so you see Charlotte's will, but also probably someone else's who's got to maybe stand up next to her in some way. We've all been there, haven't we, where someone else influences your clothing choices. And I think you can see that in that dress. So I think, and we see it in her wedding dress as well, where again, there's this unease. She's not naturally someone who knew exactly what to wear at all events and was confident. And I think you're right, that deep feeling of insecurity she has about herself as a person and her appearance, which wasn't, you've got to be careful with the language here, it's not unfounded, because she wasn't considered beautiful. And that was difficult for her. And she was very acutely aware of that and had been bullied at different points in her life and really struggled with that. And so throw that kind of very vulnerable person who's also suffered tremendous repeated loss throughout her life into a new situation. It isn't really surprising, is it? With all that we now know about, how we're impacted by the things that happen to us when we're young, that it manifests in her clothing, but also in her life in so many different ways. So yes, we see it again and again. There's so many of her garments show this kind of complicated relationship with her own self-identity.
And I felt like the striped dress in particular was, a little bit of, can you imagine it on the red carpet now? Can you imagine what people would say? And, it's kind of one of those moments of like, what was she thinking? So if somebody else was dressing her, what societal sort of pressures, I suppose, was she trying to, because she's been called up time and time again for social inadequacy as well. So she doesn't quite fit, does she, into that
doesn't,
world?
and she goes to dinner parties, and she, there's this it's actually quite a funny story where Thackeray has this dinner party and she's sort of the guest of honor, and she's newly revealed as Charlotte Brontë, the kind of great writer, because of course she writes under a pseudonym at the beginning. So she's revealed as this person, and she goes to the dinner party and she just doesn't really speak, and everyone's so disappointed, and Thackeray is so disgusted at the end at how badly this dinner party's gone that he sort of leaves his guests and disappears off to his club. So she finds this very, very difficult. And of course, it's true, just because you're a brilliant writer, it doesn't make you socially, a sort of really sparkling, naturally vivacious person. And yet she's expected to be that. And in this new London society, for someone like Charlotte, who's come from Haworth and hasn't been exposed to this kind of really sparkling world, it was very difficult for her. And also newly bereaved, nearly all her family. I think we forget that too. It's shocking, really, to have to face all those things, having repeatedly lost sibling after sibling, parents, and awful. So yes, it gave me a lot of sympathy for her, I think.
I felt that as well. I mean, loss after loss, which we'll get to in a minute.
Yeah.
But, we have a question actually from the audience. So Beth's asking, I'd love to know if there's a particular piece that appears more worn or favourited over other pieces in the archive.
Oh, now that's a really good question and a very difficult one to answer for two reasons. One, There are certainly things you can see have been, so her paisley dress, I think, has been well worn. But obviously, one of the challenges that you face is that clothing doesn't always stay belonging to one person.
Yeah.
So a lot of the things that belong to Charlotte have remained as Charlotte's and were sort of kept that way, but you can't always be certain. So there are some things which you can look at under microscopes and things and see that they haven't been altered. But a lot of the clothes have been altered, or I know were passed. Once you look at their provenance, you know were passed to someone else, so they might have been worn. So it's sometimes quite difficult to definitely answer that question. Her paisley dress, however, does have the feeling of having been quite worn.
Yeah.
So I think that, and in terms of references to it, obviously her Thackeray dress comes up a lot. So I can see she obviously did wear that because it's discussed in certain places and is associated with her quite strongly. So those questions are often quite difficult to answer for quite practical reasons because you
Yeah.
have to look at the evidence. But it's a great question, actually. I've never been asked that before, which
There you
at
go.
this point is amazing.
Yeah. Um, Okay, and then moving on. So, Charlotte finds it hard to be placed in this sort of subordinate position to those in her own class or to those whom she considered intellectually inferior. So, she's also got this immense pressure at the same time for her walking wardrobe, sorry, to signal her responsibility
Yeah.
and status in this sort of shifting class system. And I think that really comes across in the governess
Yeah.
dress. So, can we talk more about this amazing sort of archival process that you went through for this? Why this was so unusual, and also how these themes can be seen in this piece.
Yeah, so the governess dress is a really interesting find. So it's an interesting find just in the story of itself, really, and that when I came to it was very difficult to work out much about it. There wasn't any paperwork, and normally with a lot of Charlotte's other garments, I've been able to follow a measure of a paper trail. Sometimes
Yeah.
there isn't one, but more often than not, there's something, even if it's just that it was logged at a certain time in the book. And I should preface this by saying the Brontë Society started quite early. It's, I think, the earliest literary society. So it meant that Charlotte's clothes had a place to migrate back to quite early, 1898.
Yeah.
So things start coming in. And so that's one way that I can see what happens because things get logged and described and whatever. And you can sometimes see where it was bought. And so I can start there and then work from that place. With the governess dress, there was nothing. So, which was really strange. And that took me on a very complicated journey, but I could tell it was Charlotte's because of the size. And it helps that she's so small because that that really gives me a head start. But so I dug a bit deeper in a story that I'd been talking to some of the ladies at the parsonage, and they were talking about having heard this sort of myth about a box of dresses being found in the wall, but they hadn't really found much more out about it.
Yeah.
But so I went all the way back through this and then found this incredible reference to this. And started searching and realized that there were 4 items that hadn't got numbers, and that this description that had happened when they did some renovations in the building and they'd undone some things, they'd knocked some bits down, they'd found this box in the wall, and we'd never known what was in it, but they just called it a box of dresses, and everything else was labelled. Everything else I could see how it had come in,
Yeah.
but not those,
Not this
which
one.
made me think, well, it must be these because they're the only ones there. And there were 4 things: 2 cloaks and 2 dresses. So I thought, right, okay, well, that must mean the reason it doesn't have a label is because it never left the parsonage. It was
Yeah.
always literally
Yeah.
in the parsonage.
Amazing.
Yeah, amazing. And that's what is amazing about these clothes. They obviously have a wonderful story attached to Charlotte, and they tell us about her biography, but they also have their own biographies as things
Yeah.
in themselves. And I think that's wonderful. And so this certainly does. But the governess dress is a really interesting piece because it links us very strongly to Charlotte's life as a governess, which, as you rightly say, was something she found difficult.
Yeah.
She was middle class. Most middle class women didn't have to work, and Charlotte did, and she resented that very deeply. And it was the position of governess within a middle class family at that time was quite a new position. So we think now of governesses and we think, oh yes, Jane Eyre, but the reality is Charlotte helped create that perception of the governess, and certainly that perception of the governess's uniform. And so we now feel we know what a governess wears, but partly that's because Charlotte describes it in Jane Eyre. And
Yeah.
that's because it's what
Yeah.
she wore. So there's this kind of cyclical aspect to it. But when I looked at the dress, at first sight, it looks like a dark, plainish dress, and it absolutely fits the stereotype of Charlotte. So they, I thought, yes, okay. But then when you start looking at it more closely, it's got so many hidden things inside it. And you start noticing how carefully she's put these little pleats, these little tiny details, which once you start unpacking it, you realize are kind of subversive. They're saying, okay, I may have to sit in the background. I may have to fade in, but I'm going to do two things with this dress. I'm going to say I'm still here and I've got an identity and a personality. But they're also going to say, I'm not a servant and I don't want to be treated like one. So yeah, you've got this quite strong language that's coming out of this. And unlike some of her other clothes where we've been talking about them giving off quite mixed messages, this is a very clear message. It's, yes, I've got this job. Yes, it's a uniform. Yes, I've got to wear it, but I'm going to subvert it. So it's sort of the equivalent of rolling up, your school skirt to make it a bit shorter than you're meant to at school when you're a teenager. And that's what she's doing, really. So it's a very interesting dress in terms of how she feels about it. And of course, then when you look at that dress and you read it, as it were, alongside Jane Eyre, it opens up both the garment and Charlotte's attitudes to being a governess and what that was like for her. And read it then alongside her letters. And she writes quite a lot about that. Suddenly, it's an even more speaking piece, and they all speak to each other. So yeah, it's amazing how a garment can just make you see something in a completely different way.
Yeah, I get the sense that she wanted to sort of fade into the background a little bit like Jane Eyre, but, she also wanted to, she also had sort of little elements that helped her to get dressed by herself and,
Absolutely, that's a
even
good
the
point.
pocket, on
Yeah,
the
all of those things. Yeah, all of those things were key. So it's a practical garment as well. You're absolutely right. So she can dress herself. So a lot of dresses at that period were tied at the back. So you'd need a friend, somebody to kind of help you get in, and hooks and eyes at the back. This has a very interesting shape at the front and follows Quaker dress, which is really interesting because, of course, Quaker women at that time were often working in quite difficult situations. They were the ones going into prisons and all these things. And they were a wonderful representative. Well, they were kind of a template really for a working woman who was still moral, because I think there was still this view that if you were a working woman, there was a kind of negative aspect to that. It was very much looked down upon because it made you less feminine because you were forced to step out the domestic sphere. And so Charlotte's also having to deal with that. She doesn't want to work, she's forced to, and then she's treated as less of a woman because she does. So she's caught in this horrible situation, and I think you feel that angst and also have the practical way she gets around the problems of it. You're right. So the pockets would have been tied at the waist under the dress, and they would have carried the things she needed for the day. So there's also, as with all uniform, a practical element to it. So it has a lot to tell us about what her actual life was like as a governess.
Yeah, I found that one of the most interesting pieces.
Did you? Yeah.
And then obviously you've talked about loss quite a bit, but obviously I hadn't thought about it, I don't suppose, before.
No.
And so she lost her mother, then her two elder sisters, then her brother, then in a terrible twist of fate, her other two sisters.
Yeah.
So how does loss play out through her clothes? And can we also touch on the brass and hair bracelet, which I'd never heard of before, which was of her sister Emily's hair, which I know were the height of fashion during that era, but I think it was also, a way of, I suppose, having this sort of tangible reminder of the person that you'd lost.
Yeah, absolutely. For us, the hair bracelet is quite a macabre thing, really.
Yeah.
It's not something we find. And I don't know if you saw that Margot Robbie had a replica made for the Wuthering Heights, which personally I found a bit like, ooh, when you've actually studied them, it felt a bit like, I'm not sure about that. But she had a replica made for the opening of Wuthering Heights. Yes, so hair jewelry was very common at the time, and it was a way of, bear in mind, it's not pre-photographs, but it's pre-photographs for ordinary people. So it was a way of carrying close to you literally something made from the person that is lost, which, as I said, is for us a bit odd, but for them that was a normal part of things. In fact, some people just wore hair jewelry just as a fashion statement. So, but there was often this element of it being something that, was made with your dead sister or your dead brother or whatever's hair, which is very poignant. And there's a lot of hair. In fact, my friend Sarah, who's the curator at the parsonage, she says, you can't get away from the Brontë hair. It's everywhere. And it's true that, there's loads of pieces of hair jewelry, but there was a lot of death. So that is also why. And I think death figures very strongly in Charlotte's life. And you're right, from such a young age. And yes, it was normal. You know, it was much more normal to lose a lot of siblings, a lot of, you know, your parents. It was. And it's easy to forget that and to see her as this really unusual case. But it was still unusual to lose your whole family. And just because something happens more routinely, it doesn't make it any less
No.
damaging to you as a person, of course. And so, yes, I think it had huge bearing on Charlotte's life, and we see it in her wardrobe. So there's a lot of black things. One of the challenges is that black wasn't a very stable dye.
Yeah.
So you have to check what was once black. So some of the things that are now brown would originally have been black. But the dyes obviously changed because they're often made using logwood, which is very light sensitive. So that can be problematic. But yeah, there's a huge amount of things. And interestingly, some of those are things that she would only have worn post fame. So in the early years after, before she's sort of outed as Charlotte Brontë, the writer of Jane Eyre,
Yeah.
she's still obviously going up to London and going to things. And so there is sort of things like evening mitts that are made from black velvet. And there's lots of references and letters to her having been dressed in full mourning at that time. So we see the impact that mourning had on everybody's wardrobes at that time was huge. And I don't think it had dawned on me how massive that impact
Yeah.
was.
Yeah. Yeah.
And also how much it cost, because you had to wear it for a long time. And so then if you were going to different sorts of events or had to wear different sorts of clothing, you had to adapt your wardrobe. And for someone on a really tight budget, it was a really big pressure. And there's all sorts of stories of people using dyes and things during that period and it dyeing their skin. And actually some people dying from that because these dyes and things were very bad for you. So the pressure to keep up the right appearance in mourning was huge. And for Charlotte, it was a very big part of her life at different times.
Yeah.
And I think you see the impact it has on her by how quickly she sort of throws it off once she's allowed out of that last death.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And I found that at first I thought, oh, that's really strange. But having gone through bereavement myself, I think you do sometimes reach a point where you want to look forward. That doesn't in any way lessen your love for those that you've lost. But I do think there's sometimes that moment. And I think it made me realise that is perhaps what had made her feel that way. But there's mourning in other things as well, because I couldn't work out why there were so many shawls left. And of course, it occurred to me they're all associated with Charlotte. And I thought, goodness me, she was like a shawl collector. There's so many of them. And then it dawned on me that they probably weren't all Charlotte's and they were all considered Charlotte's by the end. But she'd had two sisters, a mother, an aunt. And all those shawls could have been reused, absorbed into her own wardrobe. And once I started to think about it that way, I thought, that makes total sense. You know, she's kept these things because they don't fit a particular size. They just... And then you start thinking how comforting that must have been for her to have maybe her sister or her mother or whatever shawl. So it totally changes how you think about a wardrobe and how, what it means and how its meanings change and how objects' meanings change. So what might have been Emily's then becomes a memory for Charlotte, which is, thought-provoking, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I didn't realise how much loss she'd had. I mean, obviously you know of it,
Yes,
but then when you start reading it, it's absolutely ridiculous what she
it
had
is.
to go through.
It is,
And
yeah.
yeah, watching it all play out in those
Yeah,
different, clothes is like really moving actually.
yeah. And she's amazing that she was able to write out of that. I mean, I don't know when I've suffered bereavement, you feel like you can't function, and yet she had to. So she gets back up and she's writing Shirley while her sisters are literally dying. So you see that kind of grit in her as well, which I think I found very moving.
Yeah, I mean, she's an amazing character, isn't
Yeah,
she?
she is.
Absolutely amazing.
She is
Yeah.
complicated and quite difficult sometimes, I think.
Yeah.
I often get asked, do you like her? And I think that's a really difficult question. I have tremendous respect and sympathy for her and an empathy for her and to some extent a connection. But I think it doesn't in any way lessen the fact that I think she was quite a difficult person.
Yeah. Yeah,
But,
yeah.
but that's just realistic, isn't it? I think.
But I
She's
suppose she was a creative as well,
yeah,
and
yeah,
that plays into everything. And I think that when she was creating Jane Eyre, so this was classed as sort of a naughty book,
it was, yeah,
um, but also the fastest selling book of her time. And so, I think we talked about this before we went live, but one of my favorite books is Rebecca, and I
yeah,
I see such massive
yeah,
parallels with
yeah.
that. But
Yeah.
can you delve into the similarities between Charlotte and her protagonist Jane Eyre just for a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think school is the obvious one. So school had a huge, obviously, in Jane Eyre, school is where the book sort of starts.
Yeah.
And the sort of trajectory of her life changes from that point on, really. And the same is true for Charlotte. So school for her, the first experience for school was very difficult. It's where her two older sisters became ill. The conditions were quite harsh. And even clothing there, she starts off with quite a complicated relationship with clothing because she's forced to wear a school uniform. And in Jane Eyre, Charlotte talks about what it felt like for Jane to wear this school uniform and how diminished she feels. And Charlotte obviously felt the same way. So she was at a clergy daughter's school, which isn't exactly a charity school, but it sort of is. And at that time, if you were wearing a uniform, it did sort of mark you out as being a charity girl, which was difficult for Charlotte. And she was not someone who ever liked to be put in a subordinate position. And she definitely struggled with that. And you see that so strongly in Jane Eyre. You see how she feels and how it makes her feel small, but also it kind of kicks in this feistiness that she has that, again, we see in Charlotte in real life. So there's so many parallels throughout her life. I think plainness is showing very clearly in both. So with Charlotte, we see the pain of that and what it meant for her as a person to be a woman who wasn't considered beautiful. And Jane Eyre, she creates this character to prove to the world. She says to her sisters before she writes it that she creates that character to prove that, you can create a heroine who is someone we can deeply connect with, but who isn't beautiful. And that comes out of personal experience, I think. And her complicated relationship with her own appearance really shows in the book. And I think she even sets out to write it with that in mind, to make people think about it. So there's so many parallels throughout her life. Obviously, her role as governess, she draws so strongly. And in fact, all her books, she draws so strongly from her own experience, as I suppose most writers do to a lesser or greater extent. But in this case, the parallels between Charlotte and Jane are very strong.
We
And
have a
there's
reader. We have a
yeah,
listener question that just ties in with that,
yeah.
which is: as Charlotte often used clothing as a way to express the dimensions of the characters in her book, I'd love to know if this was connected to her own personal experiences of being able to express herself through what she wore.
That's a good question. So, as I said earlier, Charlotte's relationship with clothing is complicated. On the one hand, she does use it to express herself, and you do see very strong taste in her clothes,
Yeah.
especially if you're looking at those pieces which she chose for herself. So, not the striped silk dress, maybe quite so much, but some of the other things. You notice little prints. Pretty patterns. She likes a lot of blue. She likes lots of different colours. There are some very surprising garments, which her pink wrapper that she wears on her honeymoon is quite something.
Yeah.
Her honeymoon gown. And so sometimes we see when she goes into a situation where she's less comfortable, she's not quite sure what she's doing. Her taste is less is it's less about her taste and more about her doing what she thinks she should do, and
Yeah.
that's where it tends to go
Yeah.
a bit
Go a
wrong.
bit wrong. Yeah.
But that's probably true of all of us. I think her taste definitely shows, and I think she does use clothes to express herself. When she has more money, we start to see that she buys pretty things. So there's a wonderful parasol which is so beautiful. And in fact, I've just been in discussions with someone who I did a little post on Instagram, and he recognized one that's in another museum. So we're having a talk at the moment, which
Oh,
is really
wow.
exciting. I love
Amazing.
it when you keep finding new things out because, that's what this is all about. It's not an end of a story. It's ever growing, ever changing. But this piece is so beautiful, and it's a really fringed parasol that's it looks like it's made from a shawl. It actually isn't, but it's so beautiful and so delicate. And so there are garments like that or pieces like that you can really see that she's chosen it and they represent it or a side of her. But then there are other pieces that are sort of thrust upon her. So I've forgotten what the question was, but I think that sort of answered
Yeah.
it.
No, I think definitely. Well, let's go into her wardrobe post fame. So she's famous now, and she's making some mistakes, obviously, like with the
Yep.
striped dress, which you say potentially someone else helped her with or dressed her.
Yes.
But the Thackeray dress was quite amazing because the
Yeah.
colour has remained after all these years,
It
and
has.
that's really, you even say that it's because of it, the way that it's made from cotton and alpaca, it sort of was a worthy rival of silk.
Yeah.
So can you tell us just a little bit more about the industry here, the innovations of the Industrial Revolution, which were sweeping through Yorkshire,
Yeah.
and how Charlotte might have felt wearing something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the Thackeray dress is a perfect example of her connection with the world in which she's literally living. So Haworth itself is filled with mills, and within a 9-mile radius, there were some mills that were making, one in particular that were making alpaca fabric. As you say, that was really rare. So when I did experiments, I thought when I first looked at it that it was made from wool and cotton, which is what you'd expect.
Yeah.
But I worked with a team of electrochemists and we did some brilliant experiments on it. And we were able to find that it is, in fact, as you say, alpaca, which at first I thought, what? That's really strange. But once you start delving into it, Salt's mill, so Sir Titus Salt, I'm sure people here will know who that is within this world. He had set up this kind of, he'd invented this fabric really, or had been one of the key people to do so. And Salt's mill is 9 miles away from where Charlotte Brontë lives, so very, very near. And it's only within this 9-mile radius that these things are being made. So I knew that it had to have been made literally on her doorstep. So that was an amazing thing to find. And as you say, she wears that to meet Thackeray for the first time, her literary hero. So I think it was a deliberate choice. But it's printed using very complicated techniques as well, because again, I'm sure the people listening will know about this, but where you've got different fibers, they absorb the dyes differently. So it's quite difficult to ensure that you get a uniform colour across the cloth when you're printing it. And so they would have used a special series of mordants and steam to help to fix it, which was sort of cutting edge at this point. So we're talking about 1849, 1850-ish. And so she's buying this fabric and it's literally hot off the press. And I think one thing I really started to learn about Charlotte is she knew and understood materials, fabrics, cloth. She knew about that because it's all being made around her. All her father's parishioners are working, either they're weaving or they're working in the factories, or all these things. It's all happening right there, and all these technological innovations are happening right there.
Yeah.
So in Yorkshire and in Lancashire, that's where it's all happening. So it's easy to forget that when we think about Charlotte, but she actually knows her stuff. She's growing up with it all going on. And so when she chooses the Thackeray dress fabric, you're right, it's so vivid still. I've got a picture of it here. It's such a vivid dress. It has been altered a little bit.
So intricate, isn't it?
So intricate, and it's so vivid, such vivid blue. And again, once I started working with the electrochemists, we were able to prove that what's really amazing about that pattern is, even though it looks like two totally different dyes, they're both made using different variations of Prussian blue, which again was technically very difficult. So she's really chosen a high quality fabric there. Yeah. And I think the fact that she wore that dress to go and meet William Makepeace Thackeray, her absolute literary idol, she's taking a piece of Haworth with her effectively. And you can imagine when she's feeling nervous and she knows she's wearing this cloth. I don't know whether it was something that's conscious, but you must be aware that you're taking that with you. And so if nothing else, she knows what she's looking at. She knows how to buy something that's high quality. And there's a lot of emphasis on that and the things that people write about her, that she wore good quality cloth, even if she eked things out, which she definitely did. She was very good at making men's, and she was a very able seamstress, unusually so. So her clothes are all beautifully made. And she didn't start using a dressmaker until post-fame, really, when she needed more clothes than she had time to create.
But she'd have to do not only her own sort of men's, but also the entire family's men's. And if there was an occasion coming up, you'd have to make all of the family's clothes.
Exactly. And she'd make her brother's shirts, her father's shirts. She did a lot of the sewing because she was particularly good at it. And she also did a lot of sewing for fun, which I think was something I sort of hadn't realised. I don't know why, but it wasn't something that had occurred to me. But I started realising that she's made things like bags and little purses. In fact, there's a little purse which is almost identical to one that Jane Austen made, which came sort of resurfaced a few months ago. And it's incredible to see this, and I'm fairly certain she made it herself. So these things were made recreationally. So not only is she sewing all the time, but she's also creating these beautiful little things. But she was very gifted. So yeah, sewing's a big part of life, and looking after clothing is a big part of life. And I know, slow fashion and all these things are things that we like to think about. And really, that was something they were naturally doing at that point. People were making clothes last. And it was one thing I really noticed is things have men's on them, and yet she still wore them too. And there was nothing wrong with that. People understood that it was kind of good behavior, good care of your clothes was something not to be embarrassed about. So yeah, that was all just a natural part of day-to-day life, tending things.
What kind of mile radius would the Thackeray dress sort of been from where she lived, do you think?
So in terms of it having been made within 9 miles. So the dress itself she made, but the fabric, it probably was sent off to be printed in Manchester. That's where a lot of printing happened, although Saltsmill did do some things themselves at different points. So it could even have been printed there. But anyway, we're talking very close because it's not very far, really.
No. So it's such so she wore something to meet her hero that was just so close to her home. So,
absolutely. And she knew that too. As I said, I think if you said to me and I found out that my dress had happened to be made in Hampshire, I wouldn't probably have been aware of that, but Charlotte would have been aware of that. She knew that good cloth, and she was a very proud Yorkshire woman, and was very proud of what that whole county was doing for kind of the industry of Britain. So yeah, she took that seriously.
Yeah, no, I got that from that. And then can we talk a little bit of romance? So, I mean, for all of Charlotte's insecurities, obviously she was a helpless romantic. You get that from a lot of them. So she hated to be looked at, you say, but longed to be a bride. And a letter she writes of her wedding attire to her friend, I thought was very telling, in that she chooses a white dress, but she's very detached from it. So she sort of blames it on someone else. It's a little bit of bravado because she replaces the possessive adjective of my to thee. Yeah. And I kind of thought that was really funny, but also she's almost not admitting that it was her idea.
Exactly.
Can we delve into this, the resurgence of, white dresses, I think you say after Queen Victoria, and why is this important to Charlotte at this time, do you think?
That's a very good question. 1 second, I can see my computer's going to run out of battery. So that would be a disaster. So yes, white dresses, you're right. These are a really important thing because we tend to just automatically associate white dresses with weddings these days. We're good. We've got a plug. Should have done that before. So white dresses we always associate with weddings, but actually that was a relatively new phenomenon. It wasn't that people didn't wear white before, they did, but it wasn't until after Queen Victoria's wedding that really starts to become something that, was more normal, considered more normal. And in fact, for older brides, and Charlotte would definitely have been at 37 considered an older bride, very, very definitely. And for a first marriage as well. She would have been expected to wear perhaps a darker dress, more what she ended up wearing for her going away dress, something more practical that you could wear again. So the fact that Charlotte wears white is quite a telling thing, really. You're right. Yeah. It's very strongly linked to
I saw through that straight away.
Yeah, exactly. and it surprised me because obviously I looked at the wedding dress. I didn't always do things sequentially, but it just so happened that the wedding dress was one of the things I looked at later or found out about later. So it surprised me knowing that she struggled with how people viewed her in things, and being critiqued and all of that. It then surprised me that she then wanted to be this sort of white bridal figure. But I think it's because it tapped in, as you rightly say, into this deep kind of romantic view. And bear in mind that as a child, she was allowed to read whatever she wanted, and she lived for these kind of romantic books. So she was sort of brought up on this diet, really, or brought herself up on this diet of romance books.
Was it the Lady magazine?
Yeah, exactly.
My grandma used to read those.
Oh, really? So she read all of this, and so she's got this really strong view of wanting to be part of this. And again, this is where I think her appearance comes into it. She'd been shut out of a lot of this world, and so there's this part of her where she's deeply loved. I think her feelings for Arthur Bell Nicholls was something that definitely grew. She wasn't madly in love with him when she married him at all, though he was madly in love with her, and I think that helped a lot. It helped her to know that someone was really loving her. But this deep desire to be a bride, I think, was almost it was subconscious, but it was very, very present. And so she chooses this gown, which is not massively practical and is not going to have lots of uses in the future. But the gown is one thing, but the bonnet is quite another.
The bonnet was amazing.
It is. And that still exists. And it's a very kind of ethereal, it's got lace and flowers and feathers and all sorts of things. And again, is a very strange choice for a woman of her
Yeah.
age, but it's wholly romantic. But I think it speaks to the girlishness in her, and the character, all her characters marry or end up sort of intending to marry in white. And so it was obviously something she sort of writes into the stories that she wants to create as well. So then when it's her turn, it's what she does. And it was said that she looked like a snowdrop on the day of her wedding, which I think is rather lovely. Um, and yes, it was a surprising choice, but not when you actually understand Charlotte, I think.
Yeah, and I was so surprised to find out that she honeymooned in the Castle Hotel in Conway, which is so near my hometown,
Is
and
it?
I
Oh,
must have walked past that without realizing
oh
for, I
wow.
don't know, 30 years.
Yeah,
Yeah.
to think. That's where she ended up. Yes, she did. And her pink wrapper, as we said earlier, is a fascinating garment. It's bright pink. It's sort of Pepto-Bismol pink with quite little flowers on it, bright red flowers. So it's a very interesting garment in the sense that it's obviously what she perceived to be a sort of sensual garment. I mean, it's not. It starts here and it finishes at the ground, and it's got more layers. I think you'd struggle to find her in there, to be honest. But she obviously, it was have been worn in private with her new husband. So, and it's pink, which links to, there's a key scene in Villette where
Yeah.
it sort of sets off this relationship with the man she ends up marrying, but or the main character ends up marrying. So she obviously associates pink with that, which was unusual at the time. We tend to think of it now, but that wasn't, pink wasn't naturally associated with love at that point. So yes, you can learn so much from her clothing, and there's very strong biographical elements in all of it. Which is, I think, what makes it so speaking. It's just, there's so much to find out about her as a person.
Yeah, that's for sure. And then you write, so, yet, and despite their resilience and their potent ability to affect and connect, the garments and accessories were still widely viewed as curiosities of deep interest rather than valid sources of biography, which takes us to our
Yeah,
next question. So, why do you think that garments are often treated in this way? So, we see this in fashion a lot. So,
yeah.
despite it being worth billions to the UK economy, it's constantly put on the back foot. So, what do you think could be done from a policy point of view in this sort of historical archiving space? Do you think it's more funding? Do you think that there's a way that clothes can be looked at, to be viewed, I suppose, as primary sources of evidence? What would you like to see in this space?
That's a really difficult question because I think I come across it all the time.
Yeah,
It's still viewed deep down, I think, as something quite frivolous, and it's not given the same weight. And yet, as my book, I hope, has proved, it has huge weight and it has a vast amount to tell us if we look at it and read it in the right way. You do have to treat it like you would any other source, and that you have to, have methodology and to treat it carefully. You can't just treat it as something emotive, which is what people can do. And I think that's one of the dangers of it. There is always that element with clothing, but that's why I tried to be very rigorous in my approach, because I wanted to counter that view. I think I think it stems from the fact that clothing has long been associated as feminine,
yeah,
and that is a problem. And I think if we even look back in the way that clothing is being kept, for so long they were added on. Charlotte's is a perfect example. They were brought into the museum as kind of nice bits of lightness that you put alongside all the important documents. And in a way, it's amazing they survived because, they weren't really looked after in the way that we would expect them to be now. But at the beginning, they were just seen as sort of curiosities and a way of thinking, wasn't she small? Or maybe even evocative of kind of bringing back her ghost, but not as pieces of primary evidence. And so I think partly it's because there wasn't a system in which to kind of look at things like this. We've now got a methodology, a discipline that you apply in a certain way, which I think helps. But I still know that, if I do a talk at a conference, mine is seen as the sort of light relief,
yeah,
and I could have I've read English, I could talk about Jane Eyre or whatever from a much more kind of obviously academic perspective. But to me, this has the same importance, same weight, same bearing. In fact, if not more so, because it's primary evidence. So it's difficult. I think, how will that change? That's a good question. I think when I compare how my work has been treated to how my old supervisor's work has been treated, I think we've made quite a lot of progress. In that I was given a Wolfson funding, and I don't know whether 20 years ago would someone like me have been given that for that project. I don't know. So that's good. You know, Wolfson, they really put you through. You have to jump lots of hoops to get big funding like that. So I was fortunate. So I think we're moving in the right direction, but not fast enough. I don't know in terms of policy what can be done. I think sometimes we have to separate it from art. And I say that having done drawing, so it's difficult. But I think art is wonderful, but we also have to treat this as something significant and important. Not that art isn't, because it absolutely is, but they're often lumped together. And actually, I think there's a place in museums and in other things as well to maybe view it with a seriousness but how you make people do that, I don't know.
Well,
I
think some of the things that we've even touched on, though, like it's mass skill, it's,
absolutely,
the industry, it can tell us so much about the historic industry. Yeah.
So much. And that's so important. And actually, I found when I start talking to people at dinner parties or whatever else, people are really fascinated. But you have to find a way into that. And I've had conversations with all sorts of people. And once you start chatting, they're fascinated by it. And they've never thought of clothing in that way. And yet we all wear it. Nothing walks with us so closely as our clothing. Nothing. And yet we consider it this frivolous kind of thing. And yet, as you say, it's worth billions. And for Charlotte, in that time, much of Britain's wealth was built on the clothing industry. Absolutely. It really was. And we wouldn't be where we are today in Britain if we hadn't had, that huge amount of industry, a lot of which was focused on those things. And so we have to take it seriously. But how you change people's perceptions, I don't know. It's one of the reasons I choose to work in costume, in film and television, because I feel that it's kind of a gateway drug. You can lure people in with interest in costumes and clothing, even if they come to it from thinking, well, that's pretty. Maybe then you can help them to see its significance in a different way. So I believe quite strongly in disseminating it in lots of different ways to draw more and more people in. So I think it's great to do all sorts of different things to draw people in. So you draw all sorts of different people from different backgrounds and experiences. But I think it's a waiting game of the right people going in the right spaces being given a voice. But we're a long way from where we need to be.
Yeah, that's really insightful. Thank you. And then I think that also kind of ties into my last question, which is, where can people find out more about you, your work? Is there anything you can tell us about what you're doing next before we end today?
Yeah, so I'm doing something very different, because after such a long time, because if you add up even this last patch, it's been sort of 12 years of Charlotte Brontë. So I think I love Charlotte, but it's time for a little break from Charlotte, I think. And I'll always be involved in the Brontes and the Brontë world. But so actually, I moved into something very different. I'm actually writing a historical novel at the moment, which is very different, but very much based on a true story. And clothing will play a part because it has to, it's so important. But I carry on working as a consultant. I think I'm allowed to say, I've signed lots of NDAs, but I've worked on the new Sense and Sensibility that's just coming out. I can't tell you anything about it, but I have worked on it.
My little girl who is 9 absolutely loves Sense and
Sensibility.
Really? Yeah. Well, Emma Thompson one currently is
that's my favourite.
Yeah.
I agree. It's beautiful. So I've just done that. So I'm constantly doing all sorts of different projects. I do a lot of curation, all sorts of different things. I'm working with the team at the Barbican at the moment, lots of different projects. Basically, I tend to write a lot about what I'm up to on Instagram, but I also write lots about clothing and historical fashion and all sorts of different things. I do lots of drawing on there, because drawing is still absolutely integral to what I do. And so that's, a big part of it. So so always on my Instagram, which is Eleanor Houghton Historian.
Okay, we'll link all of that.
Hello.
That's
kind of where you find me, I guess. And on my website when I remember to update it, which I need to work harder at.
Work in progress. Yeah,
it's a work in progress.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Eleanor. It's been absolutely lovely to chat to you, and I've learned so much and thoroughly enjoyed your book.
Well, I've loved being here, and I am a really fierce. I really love what you're doing at Fashion Roundtable, and if I can play any part in that, I hope I can continue to do so, because it's really important to champion this whole world,
Thank
of
you
which
so
I
much.
feel a small, tiny, small part. But yeah, so thank you
Oh,
for
thank
having me.
you. Yeah. Okay.